Hello, this is Herb Schreiner. This is part 2 of our movie, At Home in Indiana. It's a story of how people lived in our state in earlier times. It's very proudly presented to you by Hook's Drugs Incorporated. You know, the years that followed the Civil War were years of big change in the ways of the life in Indiana. And many of the changes, both before and after the Civil War, were brought about by the railroads. The railroads created new cities and towns, brought new prosperity, new importance to already established cities such as Indianapolis, Terre Haute, and South Bend. One important factor about the railroads was that Hoosiers were no longer dependent on water for transportation. The canals had long since been abandoned, a silent reminder of the hopes and dreams of another age. Farms and industries and population, no longer dependent upon rivers and canals, moved to all parts of the state. By the turn of the century, there would be 46 railroad lines linking Indiana with the east and the west and the north and south. The railroads brought the new farm machinery to Indiana farms, the new plows, cultivators, reapers, and thrashers. For farmhouse wives, the railroads brought the new wood-fired kitchen stove with its trimmings of nickel plate, in which the farm wives did the cooking for their families and the hired men. The stove and other things to make life easier on the farm could now be ordered from the new mail-order catalog. These came by way of the new rural free delivery, and the merchandise you ordered was shipped and unloaded at the local railway depot. At the start of the 20th century, the Census Bureau counted over 200,000 Indiana farms. They averaged about 80 acres each. Farm families were large. The older farmers wore chin whiskers or full beards. Women wore their hair parted in the middle, combed smooth and with a roller knot at the back. Farm children worked as hard as their fathers and mothers, and boys remained home until their 20s, when they married and started farms for themselves. Many farmers proudly owned teams of driving horses and light carriages for visiting and going to church. The young folks used them for courting, and Indiana's many covered bridges offered a place for sparking as well as a shelter from the storm. The expanding Indiana State Fair had a lot of new features for farm folks, too. Besides the farm machinery, there were the new fertilizers to learn about, and although many farmers scoffed at what they called book farming. The trotting races offered a glimpse of Indiana's great Dan Patch, the horse that never lost a race and earned over $2 million for its owners. Hoosiers went to the fair in those days in the new horse cars, which were more often than not pulled by a mule. But the day of the horse and the mule was fast disappearing. In the place of horse cars, there was the new electric streetcar, or the trolley. Hoosiers rode the first electrics in Lafayette, but soon the trolleys were clicking and clanging over the streets of most Indiana cities. Then came the first of the interurban lines, fast electric cars that ran from Marion to Gas City. Some Hoosiers called them wind splitters as a tribute to their speed, and they had fancy names like the Muncie Meteor. Some folks called them the Red Death, the Yellow Peril, and I believe they killed more chickens than you could ever eat. By 1908, the interurbans were operating over 2,400 miles of interconnected track. But there was also another new form of transportation that was claiming the attention of Hoosiers. It was called the horseless carriage. First one chugged into Indiana history in 1894 when Elwood Haynes built and successfully tested a gasoline-propelled car on the Pumpkin Vine Pike, the other side of Kokomo. And in no time at all, Indiana, already an important wagon-making center, turned to the production of motor cars. Within a few years, well over 200 different makes of cars were being manufactured or assembled in Indiana. The cars were propelled by gasoline, fuel oil, steam, or electricity, and seemed to have but one thing in common: they were expensive. In a few years, the cars would also pose some new problems. It's an early traffic jam in downtown Indianapolis, which perhaps just goes to show things haven't changed much. But if you couldn't afford a car, you could buy one of the new safety bicycles. They were all the rage, and there was bicycle clubs, bicycle trips, bicycle races, and his and hers bicycles, and of course the tandem bicycle, or the bicycle built for two. There were other men, however, who were not satisfied with remaining on the ground and were looking to the sky. In 1910, it was said that the new Indianapolis Motor Speedway contains the largest group of aviation enthusiasts in the country. Besides the balloons, there were the newly invented airplanes. both biplanes and the new monoplane. Wilbur and Orville Wright, who grew up in Richmond, were the first men to fly a heavier-than aircraft. Of course, they were regular visitors to the new speedway. But planes and balloons were still novelties, and although they were features of the early speedway, it was really the auto racing that the crowds came to see. This is the film footage taken by an early cameraman of some of the first of these races. This is the 1911 race, and Ray Haroon was the winner, and he drove the first car ever to be driven with a rearview mirror. Besides auto racing and bicycle and motorcycle racing, there were other entertainments to enjoy, like the showboats that tied up at Indiana's rivers. Some offered minstrel shows, but most of them offered melodrama like East Lynne, and audiences cheered the hero and hissed the villain. Melodrama was also the stock in trade of the road companies and the stock companies that played the town hall or the old Opry House. A few companies brought Shakespeare and the classics, but most specialized in such heart-rending epics as The Two Orphans or Bertha the Sewing Machine Girl. In the bigger cities, they played in real theaters, such as the famous English Theater in Indianapolis. But the big event each year for many Hoosier families was the circus. This magic world of spangles and tinsel and sawdust now arrived by railroad, and its wonders unloaded from big yellow and red double-length cars. Circuses liked to play Indiana. Nearly every town was a good circus town. Its people were very friendly. Peru, Indiana, became the winter headquarters for the American Circus Corporation, whose shows included the Sells Floto and the Hagenbeck Wallace shows. It became a home for many of the great names of the Big Top, too. Here's the famous William F. Cody, Buffalo Bill, star of his own Wild West show at the Peru Circus headquarters. And Clyde Beatty, one of the world's greatest lion tamers, thrilled millions with his act. It was fun in an earlier Indiana to carry water for the elephants, watch the mile-long glittering street parade with its clowns and calliopes, its elephants and lions, and the big brassy band atop a red and gold wagon. And under the big top, well, a body just didn't know what to watch. There were so many things all going on at once. There just wasn't anything like a circus. It was that newfangled thing that people called the moving pictures. They were on view in the Nickelodeons. The silent flickers were getting better than ever, like this one. It was called The Great Train Robbery, and it made history because it was the first movie with a plot and a real storyline. The first Nickelodeons were set up in empty stores, but it wasn't long before the movies were shown in real theaters. Soon the movies were turning to best-selling books for their stories, including Ben-Hur by Lew Wallace of Crawfordsville, Penrod by Booth Tarkington of Indianapolis, and When Knighthood Was in Flower by Charles Major of Shelbyville, Freckles by Gene Stratton Porter. Indiana's small boys, however, were reading more exciting things. They were called dime novels, and they told lurid tales of brave heroes with square-cut chins like Nick Carter, Buffalo Bill, Fred Fear Not, Tom and Dick Merriwell. Most parents forbid their children to read the dime dreadfuls, which made them more attractive to the small boys. Parents had another kind of problem with their older brothers, cigarettes. Many people called them coffin nails, said they were a health hazard and stunted your growth. In fact, for a brief time in the 1900s, an Indiana law prohibited the sale and manufacture of cigarettes. But cigarettes were not the only health hazard. Medical men were finding other and just as serious ones. The theory that germs and bacteria cause sickness and death was now being widely accepted. Members of the new Indiana Medical Society were urging vaccination and fighting for improved sanitation and the filling in of the swamps throughout the state. Many families continued to rely on patent medicine, and the worse the stuff tasted, the more certain the cure. However, more families were relying on enlightened doctors, their new knowledge, and their prescriptions. Firms like Eli Lilly and Company were formed to manufacture the new pharmaceuticals developed in the forward march of medicine. It was one of Indiana's earliest industries. In 1910, Indiana ranked 9th among the states in manufacturing. Steelmaking became an important industry and centered in Gary. Population began to shift, and soon 40% of all Hoosiers were living in the cities. Indiana's women were also on the march, joining suffragette movements, franchise clubs, and demanding the right to vote. The state of Indiana, always friendly to the cause of women's rights, was among the first states to permit women to vote in presidential elections. In the new and growing cities, many middle-class families lived in houses like this. On a summer evening, it was kind of a wonderful, special place to sit on the great big wide front porch on the old swing. Dad wore detachable collars and cuffs, shaved with a straight razor, wore a derby hat, and rode the streetcar to work. Mother's blouse was called a waist, and the lace made it a peekaboo. Skirts swept the ground, her stockings were black cotton, and she wore high-button shoes. Her clothes were influenced by a famous painting of the time, The Gibson Girl. A few houses now had electricity, but most houses were lit by gas, and you kept the lights burning by dropping a quarter in the gas meter, which my folks told me was a bank. Some homes had a new gadget called the telephone, and Hello Central became part of our vocabulary. It was fun in the evening to gather around the piano and sing the new songs by Indiana songwriters like the Von Tilsers and Paul Dresser, who were writing most of the hit songs that America was singing.
Then I long for my Indiana home. Oh, that was fun.
And one day it happened. The thing everyone had hoped wouldn't happen. We were at war. And there were new songs to sing as Indiana, and a nation mobilized for a war that was to keep the world safe for democracy. They called it World War I, the war to end all wars. And the Hoosiers served with distinction in the 42nd or the Rainbow Division, the 38th, the 84th Division, and other elements of the U.S. Army. At home in Indiana, we put 4 Liberty Loan drives over the top. That's Douglas Fairbanks, the silent screen star, selling Liberty bonds on Monument Circle in Indianapolis. We also marked wheatless Mondays, meatless Tuesdays, and porkless Thursdays, and we planted victory gardens. Indiana farms and factories worked overtime to provide arms and food. Then one day, November 11, 1918, it was over there. And Indiana, in common with the rest of the nation, celebrated the armistice. This is the celebration in Indianapolis. But as we cheered, we knew we were marking more than the end of Kaiser Bill. We were marking the end of an era. This war, to make the world safe for democracy, had left many scars, brought many changes on the farms and in the cities of Indiana. Some were physical changes you could see, but most were moral and social and economic changes you could only feel. And you knew these were only indications of others yet to come. But on this November day, you cheered and danced, threw confetti, kissed girls you didn't know, and for a moment forgot the problems and changes that would be yours in the world of tomorrow. Besides, it would be that kind of a time in history. The roaring 20s were just around the corner. World War I was over, and our boys came back home to Indiana. 118,000 Hoosier young men had marched off to war, but 3,350 men and 15 Red Cross nurses were not coming back. Those that came home entered a changing world. Indiana population had shifted from farm to city, and industry had become a dominant factor in our economy. Farms had become increasingly mechanized, and the new tractors had appeared. It was claimed that they could plow up to 7 acres a day. But all was not well on the farms. Prices had plummeted after the war. Corn was 35 cents a bushel, hogs $7.20 a hundred, up from $6.20. Farm organizations sprang up to protect farm interests and gave the farmer greater bargaining power. In downtown Indianapolis, a block-long war memorial was under construction, a tribute to those who fought and died so gallantly. General Pershing himself, leader of the Allied armies, would attend the dedication ceremonies. It was a confused, restless, and sad time for the returning soldier. He tried to understand the loud, gaudy, noisy age of the Roaring '20s, with its new dances like the Charleston, its short skirts and bobbed hair. Prohibition in the form of the Volstead Act had closed the saloons, but there was the hip flask with the gin made right in the family bathtub, bootleg whiskey, and a new institution, the speakeasy, which flouted the law and openly served drinks if you could get by the door. They catered to both men and women, including the new flapper, who sat at the bar with her rolled stockings and her bee-stung lips. Rouge and lipstick were becoming respectable, and more women smoked cigarettes, joined their daughters in wearing the new one-piece bathing suit to the beach. Dad joined the young man in wearing the new trunks and jerseys. Most families drove to the beach in those days in Henry Ford's low-priced Model T, the flivver that put a car within the reach of even families on a modest income. The Jokesmiths had a field day with the Tin Lizzie, but people continued to buy them just as fast as they rolled off the assembly lines. And Ford, in a day of $1 watches and $3 shoes, paid his workmen $5 a day. The blacksmiths began to close up shop, and people no longer shouted, "Get a horse," at the passing motorists. Gas pumps were springing up everywhere. Everybody wanted a car and somehow managed to buy one, posing a lot of problems for cities geared to horses and wagons, which were still around. We talked about safety programs and set up a permanent registration bureau and a state highway patrol. The manufacturing of cars in Indiana became a major industry, employing thousands, with other thousands employed in the making of parts for the new cars. In those days, if you wanted something better than Mr. Ford's Model T, you generally bought an Indiana-made car. They were something special, lovingly crafted by Hoosier workmen. For example, there were deluxe cars like the Marmon, the Stutz Bearcat, the Duesenberg, of course the Studebaker, and hundreds of others, including the Waverly Electric, which the advertisement said was preferred by the ladies. Eventually, however, the motor car business would move from Indiana, and the fine cars so painstakingly built by Indiana craftsmen would become proud collector's items and a symbol of another yesterday. The airplane had made great strides since the war, and airports were beginning to spring up in various parts of the state. Planes were also being used to carry the mail. One of the early historic airmail flights was from Frankfurt to Indianapolis. Veteran pilots would later tell of mailing bricks to each other in order to profit from government airmail subsidies. The first coast-to-coast airlines were also being put into operation, with Indianapolis a major stop. Charles A. Lindbergh, Lucky Lindy, helped set it up. Lindbergh was the nation's outstanding hero of the '20s with his nonstop flight from New York to Paris. The new airline, TAT, which is now TWA, promised coast-to-coast service in 48 hours. The airline made use of the Ford tri-motor planes. Passengers were carried part of the way by railroad train. They changed from plane to train at Indianapolis. Most people, however, still looked on the airplane as a novelty, merely one of the many thrilling attractions of the county fair. Bob Shank is at the controls of this early plane as a wing walker goes through his routine. Plane crashes were also a feature of many county fairs, as these early barnstorming pilots demonstrated their courage and daring. But there were other sounds in the air besides the roar of airplane motors. Ragtime was being replaced by something new called jazz, and you danced the foxtrot to the new sound in speakeasies, nightclubs, ballrooms. Or you listened to it over the new crystal sets. They could reach out and bring in the new sound from Chicago and KDKA and Schenectady. Soon everybody could listen as radio grew out of the cat whisker and the earphone stage. The early sets were run by batteries, but soon they were replaced with the new electric sets in cabinets with dynamic speakers. In Indiana, radio stations sprang up in principal cities, forming the basis for the big networks that came later. One of the great favorites of early radio were Fibber McGee and Molly.
It's time for Fibber McGee and Molly. Once again, NBC brings you Fibber McGee and Molly transcribed. The show is written by Phil Leslie and directed by Max Hutto.
As a matter of fact, I don't want the measurements in yards at that. I got to have it in feet. Have we got a foot stick anyplace?
No, I don't recall seeing a foot stick around, but why don't you take the yardstick?
Sure, I can use a yardstick, of course. I got my saw out there in the kitchen. All I got to do is cut the yardstick in 3 and measure it in feet that way.
You're smart.
Wonder where that yardstick is. I had it last... Oh, I know where it is. It's right here in the hall closet.
No, McGee, don't open it now.
There were other voices to be heard across the land, the voices of hooded men who rode out of the night and burned fiery crosses on lawns and Indiana hillsides. These men came to dominate much of Indiana life and politics for nearly 4 years in the 1920s, and then, as it did in the other states, the Klan died out. There were also voices in the movie houses. The movies had finally learned to talk. Soon theaters were advertising all talking, all singing pictures. An Indiana favorite, Dick Powell, was among the first talking picture stars. And then, on a Black Thursday in October 1929, the radio and newspapers brought the news of the stock market crash and the beginnings of the Great Depression. Many families were thrown on relief. Welfare funds were quickly exhausted and more had to be voted. Soup kitchens were opened. Suffering was particularly acute on Indiana farms. Farm prices had never fully recovered from their collapse after World War I. Many farms could not stand the economic blow of the new depression. In 1932, Hoosiers went to the polls and joined the nation in electing President Roosevelt. The years that followed brought the New Deal, the bank holiday, the NRA, or the National Recovery Act, the WPA, or the PWA, the CWA, and the AAA. Some of these federal funds helped Indiana, some didn't, but all helped to restore confidence, to hold out hope for the future. Some Hoosier war veterans joined in a bonus march on Washington urging passage of a bonus bill, which they argued could help alleviate suffering of former World War I soldiers. Hoosiers also elected a new governor in 1932, Paul V. McNutt. He governed with a strong hand and, among other things, pushed through a state income tax. 10,000 farmers had earlier gathered in Indianapolis also urging passage of the tax, the first in the state's history. But as the Depression wore on, more and more Hoosiers became aware of events in Europe. And a man with a small mustache named Adolf Hitler, who had started to march across the map of Europe. Some Hoosiers said it was none of our business, this war in Europe, but others, like Wendell Willkie of Elwood, said we were involved and would eventually be in it. Willkie was nominated for president in 1940 and ran against President Roosevelt. He lost, and Roosevelt went on to an unprecedented third and fourth terms. Then, suddenly without warning, on a quiet afternoon in December of 1941, we were at war. The Japanese, in a day that will live in infamy, attacked the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor. Indiana and the nation mobilized for war. Over 330,000 Indiana men and women served in the armed forces. Indiana factories and farms and army camps were an important factor in final victory. The state ranked 7th in the production of war materials. It was a time of rationing, the draft, marching men, and in the beginning of days without hope as the enemy overran Europe and the Pacific. Then the tide slowly turned. Germany surrendered, and then Japan. Indiana celebrated wildly and insanely. Our troops came home, and our honor rolls listed 10,000 dead. It seems so long ago now, VJ Day in 1945. Perhaps it's because so much has changed, so much has happened, because we've moved so fast. We live longer now, thanks to penicillin and the new pharmaceuticals. We live better in homes of new materials. We built great factories and created a long list of amazing products, some undreamed of even 10 years ago. We're beginning to learn to live with each other. We've learned the value of knowledge. We've searched for the new meanings in old truths. We reached across the land with broad highways. We are exploring the mysteries of outer space. Personally, I think these are very exciting times to be alive in Indiana, in this land of progressive, proud, and friendly people, all marching forward together to the new years and the new centuries.